Chapter 24. "Are you ready, Potter?" called out Headmistress McGonagall. "Just about," replied Harry Potter. He straightened his robe and gave his unruly hair one last attempt with a comb. Today was an important day for the people of Hogwarts. It was a day commemorated throughout the wizard world. It was a day Harry did not particularly wish to remember. The door opened, and Prime Minister Shacklebolt stepped in. He was attired in his finest dressed robes, as was fitting of his position. Harry wore plain black dress robes. He refused to wear anything fancier. "Hello, Harry," said Shacklebolt warmly, shaking Harry's hand. "Hello, Kingsley," greeted Harry in return. "How's Ginny?" he inquired. "Holding her own," replied Harry. McGonagall had, of course, informed Kingsley of the nearly successful time-reverse curse, especially as it had involved Tom Riddle. She told Kingsley in private, no need to alarm the rest of the ministry unnecessarily. Kingsley had come to the trophy room personally, along with some Aurors, to confirm the curse was indeed broken and to ensure no remnants remained. They searched Hogwarts for signs of other curses without finding anything. Then they visited the Potter residence and attempted to find out what else, if anything, Riddle had done. But Ginny's mind remained a blank they could not pierce. Kingsley looked through the window. "It's almost time," he commented. Harry looked outside and nodded. It did look a bit lighter outside. The ceremony was timed to coincide with dawn. Always dawn. McGonagall insisted Harry arrive the night before, knowing full well that he would arrive late or not at all given the opportunity. Unfortunately, there were some things even Harry could not avoid. "Are you ready?" asked McGonagall, entering the room. She was wearing full dress robes also. Her tartan plaid sparkled as threads of silver woven within caught the light. "It's time." Kingsley and Harry nodded. "Come along, then," she said, sweeping out of the room. Harry and Kingsley followed. The three walked down to the great hall, stopping at the entrance. The other Hogwarts professors were waiting outside the entrance. "Are we all here?" she questioned the group briefly. They nodded. "Then let's get on with it." McGonagall led the way into the great hall, followed by Prime Minister Shacklebolt and then Harry Potter. The other professors joined in behind. The great hall was full of people. Harry kept his face carefully neutral and his eyes fixed straight ahead as he walked down the center with the rest of the procession. "I should be used to this by now," he told himself. But he wasn't. Crowds of people pointing and looking as he passed by still made him uncomfortable. Finally, they reached the end of the hall, climbed up the steps, and walked to the seating area reserved for dignitaries. McGonagall sat in the center chair near the podium. Kingsley sat to her left, and Harry sat next to him. The rest of the professors sat on either side of them. The chair felt hard and uncomfortable, and reinforced Harry's own desire to be somewhere else, away from all those eyes that seemed to be looking at only him. Harry kept the expression from his face, forced himself to look unaffected by the unwanted attention. This was a special day, so the usual tables on the stage had been removed. The seating of the great hall had also been rearranged for this day. Several long benches replaced the usual 4 long tables. The benches were placed in rows parallel to the stage. Instead of sitting by houses, the students were placed by year. The first year sat in the front, the second year sat behind them, and so on, with the 6th and 7th years sharing the same row. Behind them sat the guests. Everyone who had been there that day was invited. Most came. Looking over the group, Harry saw lots of people he recognized. The Weasleys, of course, Ron and Hermione, Ginny, former members of Dumbledore's army and other classmates. Even Creature, fingering his gold locket, stood in the back, along with several of the other house elves. Lily and Hugo were spending the day with Hermione's parents. Harry wished he could be down there with his friends instead of singled out and up on the stand. "Which one is your cousin?" asked Kingsley, interrupting Harry's thoughts. "7th one on the left," whispered Harry back. Holly sat between her friends, Mark and Becky. "Goodness!" exclaimed Kingsley. "She really does look a lot like Lily." "Yes," agreed Harry. Kingsley wouldn't have said that a month ago when Harry last saw Holly. She looked greatly improved from that time. No longer the hollow-eyed skeleton, Holly looked a bit thin, but healthy. Madame Pomfrey reported to Harry that whatever he and Holly had discussed that night seemed to do the trick. Holly again slept through the nights, and had made a rapid recovery in her health. "We were most fortunate," stated Kingsley. "I don't know what we would have done if she hadn't convinced Snape to help." "Not much," whispered Harry dryly. "We'd all be dead." Kingsley started at that, but then nodded. "You've got a point," he agreed. "Is there anything we can do for her?" Harry looked over at Holly. He saw the hint of a smile on her lips and sparkle in her green eyes while she talked with her friends. "Not right now," he replied. "I'll let you know if something comes up." Kingsley nodded. "You do that." Headmistress McGonagall stood to speak. The whole hall grew quiet. "Friends, students, professors, and honored guests," began McGonagall, "we are gathered here today to remember." Harry tried hard to not listen. He didn't want to remember. It was too painful. McGonagall proceeded to give a brief background of Lord Voldemort. Then she described that fateful day which changed everything. It wasn't totally accurate. The number of times McGonagall claimed Harry had survived the killing curse, for example, that wasn't correct. The surviving Death Eaters never told what happened in the forest between Harry and Lord Voldemort, nor explained why Voldemort was so certain that Harry was dead. Hagrid never mentioned it either. Most likely none of them could believe what they had seen and heard, that an unarmed Harry had actually taken a killing curse from Lord Voldemort and lived. McGonagall also called the death of the snake Nagini a most fortunate and useful distraction. But its death meant more than that, much more. Those details were of little importance now. To correct them meant Harry would have to explain, and he didn't want to do that. Wasn't sure he could. So Harry sat politely, stared ahead, and waited for McGonagall to finish. Eventually she did, and sat down. Then it was Kingsley's turn. Fortunately, Kingsley didn't like to make speeches. His was mercifully short, and it was time to end with the sunrise. When he finished, the edge of the dazzling sun appeared over the sill of the nearest window. Everybody turned to look at it, imagining what it had to have been like to be here that final moment. Harry didn't have to imagine. He already knew. He filled his mind with thoughts of family and of those he loved instead. After a full minute of dazzling sunlight, everyone filed silently out of the great hall to go upstairs. Luna led the way, followed by the first years. Harry did not give a speech of his own. He never did. His silence added to the mystique of Harry Potter, but he didn't care. Speeches were for politicians and important people. He considered himself neither. McGonagall led Kingsley, Harry, and the rest of the professors off the head table and back down the aisle. Ginny waited for Harry, joining him as he walked out of the great hall, as did Ron and Hermione. The four joined the rest of the group, solemnly walking up to the memorial. There were actually two memorials, one behind a certain painting at Hogwarts, and the other, accessible by Muggle and wizards alike, lay at a quiet village near where a bridge once stood. It was a bridge destroyed by giants, not that the Muggles knew that. Many Muggles' lives were lost that day, and the monument listed each and every one. But more names could be found on the memorial, if one knew what to say and where to look. Many people would visit the memorial today to look and ponder the other names listed, the names of the people who, directly or indirectly, lost their lives at the hand of Lord Voldemort. By the time Harry, Ginny, Ron, and Hermione reached the painting, which hung across from the Defense Against the Dark Arts room, most of the people had already entered the room. This room had a special ability to expand to fit the size of the group within. The four quietly waited their turn in line. Luna gave them a friendly nod as they entered. Then she followed, closing the painting door behind her. It took a few minutes for Harry's eyes to adjust to the darkness. The semicircle room was like a large outdoors field. It was completely filled with people, and still had lots of room to spare. The purples, blue, and black all blended together to make a perfect starlit night. The The silver and gold flecks, names, did not enlarge with the room. Instead, they spread out like twinkling pinpricks of light across the walls, creating the feeling of a clear, starry night. The names were so widely spread around the room that they were easily accessible by everyone. No one moved or said anything. They waited for the first years to explore. It was their first time here. Usually, it took a while for them to look around before it occurred to one of them to touch a name, and then even longer for them to realize the importance of the names, but not today. Today, after the door had closed and the noise of the people moving stopped, when the silence in the room was complete, Albus stepped boldly forward, almost as if he knew what he was doing and what to expect. He reached out and touched one of the twinkling names. Immediately, a shaft of gold light shot out of the name. The rest of the first years jumped back in surprise. The shaft of light stopped just above Albus's head and formed the figure of a familiar person. The person with piercing black eyes, stringy shoulder-length black hair, and a hooked nose stared out defiantly at everyone. His long robe swirled and his lip curled up in a familiar sneer as he slowly turned, hands on his hips as if to survey his class. "This is Severus Snape," announced Albus in a voice loud and clear enough to be heard by everyone in the room. "I'm named after him. He's a Slytherin." The Slytherin students in the room started at that. There were few Slytherin names on the wall. "He was very brave. He saved my dad, Harry Potter, and he saved me. I wouldn't be here today without him, and I wish—" Albus's voice cracked a bit here. He started again. "I wish that Lord Voldemort hadn't killed him so that I could meet him and tell him thank you." At this point, Albus broke down and started to cry. It was Holly who moved up to comfort him. James reached out, gently touched the figure of Severus Snape with his wand, and it exploded in a shower of light, which faded away, leaving the room again in darkness. In the darkness, the other students moved forward, each searching the wall, looking for names to touch and see. More figures shot out in a shaft of gold and turned. Surprisingly, none of the figures overlapped. Then the others in the room moved forward, finding their own names to view and remember. Ginny liked to revisit Fred, forever young, happy, cocky. Besides his parents and Sirius, Harry often chose Cedric's name. If only he'd been more selfish and greedy that day. If only he'd grabbed the goblet alone, for himself. Maybe Cedric would still be alive. Time seemed to stand still in the room. Figure after figure would appear and vanish, to be replaced by others. Eventually, the room cleared. One could grieve only so long before returning to the needs of the living. There was a huge picnic-style breakfast waiting for everyone outside on the front lawn of Hogwarts. Harry looked around and saw Holly still in the room. She was staring at the figure of Severus Snape. He moved to join her. "He looks kind of scary," Holly said to Harry, "but he was really quite nice." Harry nodded politely. He wished he knew the Snape she knew. "I'm never going to see him again, am I?" Holly asked. "No," said Harry quietly, "but he'll always be with you in your memories." "I'm glad we didn't have to modify them," she said softly. "Me too." They both stared at the figure of Severus Snape. Presently Harry asked, "How are you doing?" "Fine, sir," replied Holly. "Look!" She pulled open her robe and revealed a brightly colored woven belt wrapped around her waist. Tied securely to it was Lily's wand. "I got Mum to send me one of her old belts to use to tie it on," she said proudly. "Now I know I'll be safe in the daytime, too." Harry smiled. "You know that isn't necessary, don't you?" he stated gently. "I know," she replied soberly, "but it makes me feel better to do it. And," she said, looking up at the still circling figure of Severus Snape, "it makes me feel closer to him." Harry looked up at Severus Snape just as he vanished into a showering sprinkle of light. "I think he'd like that," said Harry. "Are you hungry? I am. Would you like to come out with us for breakfast?" "I guess so, sir," replied Holly. Harry took Holly's hand. The two joined Ginny, Ron, and Hermione, who already stood by the door waiting. They walked outside and into the hallway. Albus, James, and Rose stood waiting for them there. Together, they all walked down the stairs. "So," Albus asked Holly conversationally, "you think you passed all your exams?" "I hope so," replied Holly. "I studied long enough." Harry knew Holly had even gone to all the professors and apologized for her earlier sleepy behavior. Then she had requested additional work to make up for it. All the professors seemed to understand, and were happy to accommodate her. "How about you?" Holly asked back. "I should," replied Albus, "but I doubt I'll get any outstandings." "You'll be lucky to get any exceeds expectations the way you studied," commented Rose dryly. "Hey, I studied," said Albus, sounding hurt. "Just not when you were looking." "That's right," said James loyally. "I saw him studying." Rose laughed. "We'll see how much you studied when the exam results come out." Then Rose asked, "Will you be coming back to Hogwarts next year, Holly?" Holly smiled. "I hope to," she replied. "But I may have to talk my dad into it. He's not too crazy about Hogwarts, you know." "That's true," smiled Harry, listening in. Then he thought, maybe I'd better warn him about Lily's wand. Or not. The group reached the entrance of Hogwarts and stepped outside. It was a beautiful day. Colorful flowers bloomed everywhere. Picnic tables piled with food and serviceware dotted the lawn. The sun streamed down on the students and guests alike, who gathered at the tables eating. Becky ran up and grabbed Holly's hand. "Come on," she shouted, dragging her off. "I've saved you a seat." Holly waved goodbye to the Potters as she ran to join her friends. As Holly and Becky made their way to the tables, Martina Goyle stuck out a leg. Becky tripped and fell. "Oops," said Martina with false concern. "Did that hurt?" she asked, looking over at Holly. "Oh, grow up," said Holly with disgust while helping Becky stand. Martina pouted and turned back to the table with her friends. Holly scanned the group. Both Richards brothers were there. Tom Richards survived his detention and was again his usual arrogant self. James, Albus, and Taylor had sat vigil every night during Tom's detention, waiting for and watching his return. "Stay if you must," said Holly, "but don't tease or make catcalls," she urged. "You remember how that felt. It'll make things worse between us all, not better. Believe me, I know what that can be." And so they sat silently, waiting and watching. Taylor had his own nightmares about that night to deal with. The next evening, Paige, Tony, and Scorpius joined the Potters and Taylor, also waiting. Most likely they had come to defend Tom, if necessary. The two groups never spoke, but Tom later mumbled an apology to Taylor. Tom Richards finished the rest of the school year without any further infractions. Watching the two boys eat their breakfast, Holly could tell they still oozed dislike, but the blinding hatred of before was missing. That was something. Becky and Holly joined the rest of the Hufflepuffs at the table. Many, like Mark and Susan, sat elsewhere eating with their parents. Ben looked up at their return. "Any trouble?" he asked, having seen Becky fall. "No," replied Holly, sitting down in front of a plate. "Just the Slytherins. Nothing we couldn't handle." Holly looked around. The tables were decorated with pots of white butterfly orchids that fluttered in the wind, while the snake plants next to them curled their leaves at the slightest touch. Hairy toads sat happily beneath the tables looking for bits of food. The white and pink coral bells that once lined the outside walls of Hogwarts were replaced with purple wolfsbane that howled mournfully in the breeze, and huge multicolored snapdragons that snapped at flies and bees that flew too near, and fingers that got too close. Bright green poisoned sumac crept up the sides of the castle. The miniature snapdragons on the lawn were replaced with small, spiky gray spider lilies that waved their petals gently in the breeze, giving off the faint odor of rotting meat to attract the flies. In the distance, Holly could see the blue-faced pixies playing hide-and-seek in the pink heather, while the damselflies fluttered about, busily picking the red pepper berries. "Aren't you hungry?" asked Becky, reaching for seconds. "Are you okay?" she asked with concern, noting Holly had yet to begin eating. "I'm fine," replied Holly, dishing up some food. She had come to Hogwarts because she had to. At first it was creepy and scary, But now it felt normal. She had friends here and family. Holly took a bite of sausage. Dad may not be too happy about it, but she definitely wanted to return. Who knew what would happen at Hogwarts next year? The end.